Every language around the Etruscans has cousins. Latin has cousins. Greek has cousins. Etruscan has none. For 2,000 years, nobody could explain that. A people appeared in central Italy, built cities of stone, and vanished into Rome without ever explaining where they began. Herodotus said they sailed from Anatolia, fleeing famine, centuries before Rome was even a village. For 25 centuries, that story stuck. Ancient DNA has just torn it apart. If your family traces to Tuscany, this is not distant history. This is written into your own chromosomes. So let's go back to the beginning. Before Rome, before Latin, before anyone agreed on anything. Around 900 BC, a distinct culture emerges in the region we now call Tuscany. Archaeologists call it Villanovan, after a farm where the first graves were dug up. These were the ancestors of the Etruscans, ironworkers, farmers, cremators of the dead, urns shaped like tiny huts. By the 7th century BC, their villages had grown into 12 great walled cities. Cerveteri, Tarquinia, Veii, names most people never learn in school. They traded across the Mediterranean, buried their dead in painted tombs, and built the first real cities in Italy. Rome, at that point, was still a cluster of huts on 7 hills. Etruscan kings would eventually rule that little settlement. Rome learned its alphabet, its rituals, its engineering from them, and yet their language survived Latin's spread for centuries, stubborn and untranslatable, until it simply stopped being spoken. So who were these people, really? For centuries, historians only had 3 theories, and they all disagreed. Herodotus said Anatolia, migrants from Lydia fleeing a famine so severe half the population had to leave. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing centuries later, said no. They were native, born from the Italian soil itself. A third theory pointed north, to the Alps, to migrants pouring down from Central Europe. 3 origin stories, 3 different homelands. Genetics had never been able to test a single one until now. The breakthrough came from something almost mundane: teeth. The dense bone inside the inner ear and the roots of teeth hold DNA that survives thousands of years underground. Researchers gathered remains from Etruscan burial sites across Tuscany and Lazio, spanning nearly 1,000 years. A team working with the David Reich lab at Harvard sequenced genomes from these skeletons and compared them to populations across Europe. What they found overturned Herodotus in a single stroke. The Etruscans were not Anatolian migrants. Genetically, they were almost identical to their Latin-speaking neighbors. Same ancestry, same population, and yet one people ended up speaking a language unrelated to anything else on the continent. That is the puzzle at the heart of this story. The body says one thing, the mouth says another. Let's slow down and look at exactly what the DNA showed, piece by piece. The 2019 study, led by geneticists working with Harvard and the University of Florence, examined 82 individuals, spanning from before the Etruscan cities rose to well after Rome had absorbed them entirely. The result? Etruscan ancestry matched a mix already present in Bronze Age Italy, mostly local, with a strand of steppe ancestry. That steppe ancestry arrived thousands of years earlier, carried by herders moving in from the east across the whole continent. It is the same ancestral layer found in nearly every population from Ireland to Greece, which meant the Etruscans were not an intrusion into Italy. They were Italy, the same population that became the Romans. There was no Anatolian founding migration detectable in the DNA at all. Herodotus was not lying. He was likely repeating an old story about trade contact, mistaken for ancestry. Genes and stories do not always travel together. That single fact rewrites a chunk of ancient history. So if the ancestry is local, why does the language look like nothing else in Europe? This is where the story gets stranger than most people expect. Almost every European language today, Latin, Greek, Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, belongs to one enormous family, Indo-European. That family arrived with the steppe migrations, the same wave that gave most Europeans a slice of their ancestry. Etruscan is not part of that family. It is what linguists call a pre-Indo-European isolate. A survivor, a language spoken before the Great Migrations reshaped everyone else's tongue. Here is the part that should stop you cold. The DNA says the ancestry changed. The language says it never did. Steppe migrants mixed into the local population and brought new genes. But somehow, the older language held on. That is unusual. Normally, when new ancestry arrives in large numbers, it brings its language with it, and the old one dies. That is exactly what happened almost everywhere else in Europe. The Etruscan homeland is the exception. Somewhere in the mixing, the pre-Indo-European language survived while the genes moved on without it. That single fact is why linguists have chased this mystery for over a century, long before DNA could even be tested. So the DNA does not solve the language mystery, it sharpens it into something far more interesting. Language and ancestry are not the same story. The Etruscans prove it more clearly than almost any population on Earth. Let's go further back and trace exactly where that older, non-Indo-European layer of Italy came from. Around 7,000 years ago, farmers migrated into Italy from Anatolia, bringing wheat, cattle, and permanent settlement. That population became the genetic bedrock of the entire peninsula, and it likely spoke languages unrelated to Indo-European. Thousands of years later, steppe herders arrived and mixed in, changing the genetic picture but not erasing it. In most of Europe, the steppe language, an early form of Indo-European, replaced whatever came before almost entirely. In Tuscany, something held that pattern back. The old tongue kept its grip even as the genes reshuffled. Researchers think geography played a role. The hills of Tuscany are rugged, closed off, easy to defend, and hard to absorb. A population can absorb new blood through marriage and trade while still teaching its children the old words at home. That is the mechanism many linguists now favor. Language is taught in the home. Ancestry is inherited in the body. They can drift apart. It is worth pausing here. This is the channel's whole reason for existing. History alone could never have proven this. It took population genetics, haplogroups, and admixture modeling to separate what the stories claimed from what the bodies actually carried. Now, let's look at exactly what markers researchers found and what they mean for the people descended from this population. One detail stood out. Etruscan Y chromosome lineages showed continuity across 1,000 years, right through the Roman conquest. Male lineages that existed before the cities rose were still detectable in skeletons buried centuries after Rome absorbed the territory. Rome conquered the cities, absorbed the citizens, dissolved the political system. But it did not erase the biological population. The people simply became Roman citizens who happened to descend from the older Tuscan lineage. That continuity is measurable today. Modern Tuscans still carry a distinguishable genetic signature tracing to this ancient population. A study comparing modern Tuscan villages to ancient Etruscan remains found a genetic thread that never fully broke. 2,500 years, and the biological line held on in the same hills where the cities once stood. That is not a small claim. Most ancient populations in Europe were diluted, replaced, or scattered within centuries, not millennia. The Etruscan case is one of the clearest examples of genetic persistence found anywhere on the continent. Now let's talk about what actually broke this continuity, because something eventually did. The turning point was not a single battle. It was 3 centuries of slow, grinding absorption. Rome fought the Etruscan cities one at a time, picking them off through the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. Veii fell first, after a siege that ancient writers claimed lasted 10 years. The city never recovered. One by one, Tarquinia, Vulci, Cerveteri, and the rest lost their independence, their armies, their political voice. What they kept, for a while longer, was their language, their religious practice, and their family lines. By the time of the Social War, in the early 1st century BC, Etruscans gained full Roman citizenship. That single legal change accelerated everything. Intermarriage, migration, and Latin schooling spread through every Etruscan town. Within 2 or 3 generations, Etruscan stopped being anyone's first language. It became a temple language, then a memory. By the time of the Emperor Augustus, it was already rare to hear spoken aloud outside a handful of religious colleges. The Emperor Claudius, in the 1st century AD, wrote a 20-volume history of the Etruscans because even he saw it fading. Every volume of that history is lost. We know it existed only because other writers mentioned it. So the language died in silence, undocumented by the very civilization that absorbed it. But here is what genetics adds that history alone never could. The bloodline did not die with the language. Researchers tracking mitochondrial and Y chromosome lineages found them threading continuously into the Roman imperial period and beyond. The tongue was silenced. The people who spoke it kept farming the same hills, marrying, and passing down their blood. This is the part I find hard to sit with. A whole identity erased from speech, but never from the body. If your ancestry traces to central Italy, some fraction of what made the Etruscans is very likely still inside you. Not as a language you could speak, not as a name you would recognize, but as a measurable thread in a genome. That is the wedge this whole story turns on. The record burned. The bones did not lie. Let's look at what specific traces survived, because the list is longer than most people expect. First, religious practice. Roman divination by studying animal organs came directly from Etruscan priests called haruspices. Roman generals would not march to war without one of these priests reading the signs first. Second, engineering. The arch, drainage systems, city planning grids, Rome borrowed all of it from Etruscan builders. Third, and strangest of all, some Etruscan words survived buried inside Latin itself, disguised beyond recognition. Words like persona, the Latin term for a mask, likely trace back to an Etruscan root altogether. The word window in English carries a Norse root, but the word person in nearly every European language may carry an Etruscan one. Think about that for a moment. Every time you say the word person, you are speaking a fragment of a language Rome tried to erase. Linguists at the Max Planck Institute have traced a handful of these buried roots through centuries of Latin borrowing. Words for theater, for names, for certain family titles all carry traces that do not fit Latin's own grammar. A language can lose its speakers and still leave fingerprints in the mouths of the people who replaced them. That is the strange gift of the Etruscans. They vanished as a people long before they vanished from us. So where does the DNA and the language leave us? Let's put the pieces on the table together. The genome data says the Etruscans were not migrants from Anatolia. Their ancestry sits squarely in local Italian populations. David Reich's team at Harvard found their genetic makeup nearly identical to the Latin speakers living right next door. So the mystery was never about where their bodies came from. It was about why their tongue refused to match anyone else's. That answer, most historians now believe, is older than Italy itself, a language surviving from before the Indo-European wave arrived. While Celtic, Germanic, and Latin speakers arrived in wave after wave, one small pocket of people simply held their ground. Geography protected them for a while. Hill towns, defensible ridges, a coastline that kept invaders at a careful distance. But geography could not protect a language forever. Not once Rome decided the whole peninsula would speak with one voice. By the time of the Social War, most Etruscan cities had already accepted Roman citizenship, and with it, the Latin tongue. The last known Etruscan inscription dates to the 1st century of the Common Era. After that, silence. A tongue spoken for perhaps 2,000 years went quiet in the space of a handful of generations. And yet the DNA never left. The people who once spoke it simply began speaking something else in the same bodies on the same land. Population geneticists studying modern Tuscany have found genetic continuity stretching back through this exact stretch of ground. Not identical, centuries of migration have layered new ancestry on top, but the old thread is still detectable, still traceable. So if your ancestry traces to central Italy, there is a real chance a piece of this story runs through you. Not a language you can hear anymore, but a body descended from people who once spoke words no living person fully understands. That is what population genetics gives back to people, not a myth of grand origins, but proof of a stubborn, continuous thread. The Etruscans did not vanish. They were absorbed, renamed, rewritten into someone else's empire, and they are still here. Every mirror, every mask, every stubborn old word Rome could not quite scrub clean carries a piece of them forward. If you carry Italian ancestry, look at your own family's oldest stories again. Some threads run far deeper than anyone told you. That is the quiet thrill of this work. A dead language, a buried people, and somehow, still, a living signature. If this story found something in you, stay close. There are more bloodlines waiting to be decoded and more of your own story to find.